see how we can change our legend to see more variation in the data. So the default is that Social Explorer creates 11 classes using its own default mechanism. And if you click on the this icon at the bottom, you can see the legend. You can see it's going from 15,000 to 100,000. You can click on any of the cut points to see which census tracts fall within that cut point. You can see not a lot fall within each specific one. And then you can click on it again, the one that you've highlighted, so that you can go back to the original. So let's change this so that we can actually see more variation in our data. So if you click on the pencil icon, it'll open up the same drop down that opens up when you click here as shaded area. And then you can click on cut points to change what these are and change how many there are. So you can see, as I said, 11 and the default. When you open this window, you can also see the distribution of your data. So you can see a lot of the data is centered here between around 30 to 80K. And then you can see that it tapers off as you get higher. There's not that many census tracts in these higher categories. So first, let's change the number of classes that show up. So let's change this to 5. I like to stay between 5 and 7 because it's a little bit easier for the human eye to see variation in the colors when you have fewer versus when you have something like, 10 classes. It's a little bit harder sometimes to see a little bit of the variation. So let's stick to 5, and I'm going to click done. I'm not going to change the method yet. And let's zoom out, and we can see what that looks like. Okay, so we're seeing a little bit more variation because now there's only 5 colors rather than just 11 colors. And again, you can click on them to see which ones fall within them. So now let's change these, and let's just close this window first. And let's click here and click on cut points, and let's change the method. So first option is equal interval. Equal interval takes the lowest value, takes the highest value, and then creates cut points classes that are in equal range. So for example, this is close to about 60K. And sometimes it's not able to do exactly depending on what the data looks like. So for example, here it's not going all the way up till close to 120K, but it tries to divide it as equally as it can. And so let's see what happens to our representation. And you can see it looks pretty different. Most of them now look a much lighter color than they did before. And the reason is, if we go back to our cut points, we can see since a lot of our data is here, now based on the way these classes are, most of it falls within these two classes. And so that's why they're light. So this is really nice when you want, clean numbers, and also when you want to have equally spaced groups, depending on what you're representing. This can be pretty useful, but is not quite so useful if your data is concentrated in a certain area. Another option then is quantile. So if you have 5 classes, when you have quantile, what you have are quintiles, where each class contains 20% of your data. So the range might be very different. So you can see here the range is much smaller than the one for this last class, but each of them contains 20% of your data. So of all the census tracts, 20% of them are contained in this class. So this allows you to see percentiles really well if you create 10 of them. And so you can say, it also helps to say, okay, this is where the top 20% of my data is versus the bottom 20%. And if we click on that, and if we could, okay, we'll have to pause a second. It looks like this needs to be reloaded. Oh, there we go. And now we can see a lot more variation in the data, and it's not like it looked before. So this is great when you want to look at quintiles, when you want to think about, some percent of your data. Oops, sorry, wrong place. And go back to cut points. And the last option that I use generally is this natural breaks, which tries to find a balance between quintiles and equal intervals. So you can see it's also trying to find that balance between quantiles where your distribution of your data is well represented versus here, which is having equal size classes. And so this uses a formula to try to figure out the classes. And let's see what that looks like. And you can still see a good amount of variation in this data. One other thing to note with the cut points is you can also create custom cut points. So for example, if you're working with certain data, let's say for this median income, maybe you want to have a cut point that shows where the is splitting this where the poverty level is. Maybe you want it based on income tax bracket. So you can have a lot of different, decisions on why you want certain cut points. So you can customize them and move them around as you need to. You can also write in the value. So I'll stick to natural breaks for now. Okay, and then we can see the variation in our data. Okay, so great. Now let's turn off the mask for now. So let's go back to looking at the data at the US level. Okay, so we're gonna turn off our mask so that it goes back, shows us all the data. So we'll click on this X sign and we'll click yes, clear, and we'll go back and let's zoom out now to the US. Okay. And we can see that it doesn't look like what we had looked at initially. And again, that's because now this legend that we created did the classification based on the data for New York. So the natural breaks, the formula that was applied, was based on the data for New York, not based on the data for US. And now all it's doing is just trying to apply that same legend to all this data. If we wanted to recalculate what natural breaks would be, or quintiles, or equal interval, we'd click on cut points again and now reset it to natural breaks or quantile, whichever one we want it to calculate. It can take a second sometimes. And and so this is important. You always want to make sure that you're changing your legend to reflect the data. If you just leave it the default, then you don't need to worry about it. But if you do decide to change it, then you want to make sure that you go back and check your legend. This So now once you made your map, this is now when you can start using it to see what's happening in a specific location. If you're interested in the US at large, you might want to look at this whole map and talk about what patterns you see. You may also decide you're more interested in specific areas. Let's say you're interested in looking at California. We were looking at New York before, and then you can see what's happening um, in here. So for example, we know the San Francisco has very high median incomes, and you can kind of explore those patterns, but it is also near other counties and census tracts that don't have as high median income. So you can also look at disparities. If we go back to New York, it'll take a second to load. And we can also look at what patterns we see here for New York, thinking about, back to Morningside Heights, its relationship to Harlem, and Harlem's and the relationship to the rest of the city, and what disparities we see here. And so this gives us an insight into what these areas look like. We can always change our data. We can also look at what this used to look like historically. When you're going historically, before you change the data, you probably want to change the geography level because most times census tract will not be available. So let's go back to county and then let's change our data. We can stick to median income if we want, but we want to change the year. So we'll click show all years, and maybe we want to see how this was in 1920. And then once we click on 1920, we can look through the different data. So here, this is race data, or we can stick to looking at something. Well, it looks like they don't have median income, but we can look at things like number of homes owned, for example, and see what that looked like at that time. We can also just look at the population or education, or if we want to think about migration, we can look at native foreign born. And you can change this. You have lots of different years to work from so that you can compare and see what's been happening historically. If you want to compare data to each other, Social Explorer has a really nice feature, this compare feature. And so then you can have maps side by side or swipe map. So let's look at what a swipe map looks like. And so first, right now, can't really see much because both maps are showing the same thing. If we change our data, let's say now instead of 1920, maybe we look at 2000. And then we can change our data here, and maybe we look at something still related to housing since we just looked at that here. And then we can see like owner occupied housing units. and then we can see what patterns we might see in the data across. You could also look at the same data but at a different geographical level to see what a differences that you see across those geographies. So for example, take one at the state level and one at the county level. So let's change our data. Let's do something more contemporary, so it's a little bit, there's more options for us to work with. Let's go back to 2019. And this time, let's say we look at education, and let's look at educational attainment for the population 25 years and over, and who has a bachelor's degree or higher. Okay, and so this is at the county level, and let's change this to be the same variable. So we'll go 2019, education, bachelor's degree or higher, and this one will change it to be at the census tract level. Okay, and so now we can see, what do we see at the county level, and then what detail do we see when we switch. It's also great when if you look at things at the state level, you can also see that, at that higher geographic level, you might not really see as many patterns as you see once you go to the census tract level. Some of that is also because you might want to play around with the legend, but just something to keep in mind. You can adjust the legend. So if you click here and click cut points, as we did before, you can decide if you want the legend to apply to both maps or not. So that way the same colors are applied, and that's usually something you probably want to do. So that way the colors mean the same thing on both maps. And in this case, you can decide to change classification method, or you can keep it. And then you can see what's happening across. And you can see based on this classification method, when we go to state level, we see very little variation, and then we can see a little bit more what's happening once we look at the census tract level. You can also have maps side by side so that you can look at both at the same time. And when you hover over, when you have these compare maps, you can see the value for both variables that you've chosen. In this case, since we have the same data, it doesn't quite make sense. But if we change the data so that both are at the same geographic level, so for example, let's say we take this as census tract level and we change our data to look at back to median income. Okay, then when we hover, and right now you can't see them because they're not actually linked. So you can see if you click here, you can make sure to uncheck this and check this back off, and it should show you now both of them. So you can see the population and also the median household income for each of these tracks. Great. Another way to look at multiple data points on the same thing, so we'll turn this off for a second. Let me close this. We can look at something like race. So let's say let's change our data. Let's go back, and race, let's say we're looking at the white alone population. So we can see what that looks like. Let's change it to be, this shouldn't, weird that it's disappearing. Let's go back to the county level. Make it a little bit easier, make sure we don't have any missing data. And now let's add something to this. So before we were just clicking and choosing different options, but if you want to add multiple things to the same map, and you can usually do this with things that fall within the same category. So for example, this is different races within the total population. What it will do is it will now show based on whichever one is higher. So for example, it has one legend for the white population, which is this first legend. If you click on this arrow, you can see the second legend, which is this yellow option for the African American population. And then if you hover over, you can see what both are, and it'll show yellow if the black population percentage is higher, and it'll be blue if the white population percentage is higher. And you can see for some of them, in some of these cases, the population is, for the black population, is so small, but it doesn't look like there's missing data anywhere, so it looks like we have data everywhere. And then here there are certain places where the black population is higher. You can add even more data to this, so you can decide, okay, I actually want another one, and then you'll see that show up as well. One other way of visualizing this type of data, specifically looking at race, or any type of data that's about people, specific counts of people, you can change the type of visualization if you click here to dot density. And what that will do is, instead of shading the tract or whatever geography you're looking at, it will show you a dot where each dot represents a certain number of people, and you can change how many people it represents to go higher or lower, so you have more or fewer dots. This if we zoom back into New York, and let's maybe make these fewer dots. And now we can see different groupings and where people live. You might just, let's change this from the county to the census tract level. It won't change too much, but it'll allow you to see it a little bit better. And let's add some more data. And one thing to note is whatever you plot first is what gets added first. So the white population was added first, then this, then this, then these other ones on top of it. And so you can actually see what's happening where these get added. If instead, let's say I uncheck this, and then I add this in last, it gets plotted on top of the others. So sometimes it can be then a little bit difficult to see, especially since the white population is so much higher. So you always want to make sure that then if you have ones that have a higher amount, you want to plot those first. And here you have your legend. You can see which color corresponds to which group. Okay, and the last thing to show is now that you've created all these maps, how do you share them? So one way is you can export it as an image, and you can decide what the aspect ratio is, zoom, and what format it downloads as a PNG image with the title, scale bar, and legend, or if you want an archive with separate images. I just recommend keeping it all together, and you can decide what area you want to include in that image. Okay, and you can change your title, um, with the name of the project. So another way is you can click share, and then you have a link that you can share. You can embed this on a website. You have an embed code. You can also just email it. You can add collaborators as well if you want. Another thing is if you want to create a presentation is you can click on tell a story and click start a story, and then you can have slides, you can have a cover for a presentation, you can change the background of this slide, you can add a title and a description, and then you can add multiple maps. So here you could have this one, and maybe you want to add multiple dimensions to the story, looking at, for example, first we looked at median income and then race in New York City, so you might add multiple slides, and you can say whether you want a swipe map side by side or a single map, and you can continue creating your maps this way. So let's just choose one of those examples that we had done before, median income. And in this case, if you were focusing on New York, you might have wanted to mask your data. And then let's look at the preview. And so you'll just have slides to walk through. So if you're doing a presentation and you want to show these interactive maps, this is a great way to do it. So you don't have to do a static image. And here there's nothing, no title or anything because I didn't edit that. But that's how you would create a story. And you can also download that as a PowerPoint. Great, so that's about it for this workshop.